Hello and welcome. You're watching Nothing But the Truth. In less than 48 hours, Arun Jaitley will present his third budget, and most people believe it's a critical moment for the Modi government. This could be the last opportunity to tackle the economy's problems and give it a new direction. Hereafter, electoral politics and shortage of time could limit the Modi government's options. So today we examine the challenges Mr. Jaitley has to tackle and also ask what are the steps he should announce in the budget. My guests, the former Chief Economic Advisor and Chairman of Kotak Mahindra Bank, Shankar Acharya, the Chairman of Infosys and Indo-Sind Bank, and the Vice Chairman of Ashok Leyland, R. Seshasayee. Dr. Acharya, let's start with the raging debate about how credible and reliable is the way India measures GDP growth. Arvind Subramaniam and, according to the papers, Raghuram Rajan have both expressed concern, and the recent revised figures issued by the Central Statistical Office have, in a sense, underlined those doubts. But a former Chief Economic Advisor, Kaushik Basu, now the Chief Economist at the World Bank, has endorsed the government's method of calculation. What's your view? Do we have a credible way of measuring GDP, or are there critical questions that need to be answered?
Karan, I think this is a debate which will go on for a while, and I certainly can't give you an authoritative view since I haven't gone into the data in great detail. But when I looked at this a few months ago, recall it's just about a year ago when the new series came out from CSO, there were clearly some anomalies in terms of what the earlier series showed. I mean, particularly, I think if you go back to, if you recall 2013-14, when we had a mini balance of payments crisis, and everybody at that time thought growth was under 5%, industry was flat on its back, and so forth. Later, the new series tells us its growth was nearly 7%, and industrial growth was perhaps 6% or thereabouts, not zero. So, I mean, and there are many other anomalies like that. So I think my own position at this point is that I feel the current series, the new series, probably overestimates underlying real economic growth of the Indian economy by somewhere around 1 to 1.5%.
That's a very clear answer.
But I can't prove it.
Mr. Seshasayee, in a sense, this concern about how we measure GDP is highlighted by the doubts about this year's figure. The government has recently upped it from 7.2 to 7.6. The World Bank comes in even higher at 7.8. But on the other hand, industrial production and capital goods sharply declined in November, and then they declined again in December. And as you know better than me, on the ground, credit offtake, company profits and turnover, and exports are all performing either flat or poorly, and the economy doesn't feel as if it's growing at 7.6. What's your feeling? Are we growing at 7.6, or is that a misleading figure?
Well, I think the math is not adding up. I mean, we have seen, for example, very wide divergence between numbers that are coming out of official institutions. For example, in the last quarter, we had manufacturing growing like blazers at 12.5% or thereabouts, whereas the IIP data was meek 0.9%. And this is not the first time that's happened. It's been happening repeatedly, and curiously, there is no explanation for this continuing divergence. And that's one part of the problem. But I think the other part of the problem is that the people don't feel that it is anywhere near that kind of growth rate on the ground. And that's not merely people from the industry. I think the common man, is not able to relate to this kind of growth numbers. In any event, I don't know whether the GDP number is a relevant discussion point in the context of making sense to the common man. I think perhaps we ought to be looking at the more relevant and more impactful numbers like job creations. Curiously again, in this country, we haven't got around to getting numbers on a real-time basis, even on a quarterly basis, anything like the unemployment numbers, stratified unemployment numbers and percentages, and that to my mind is a very serious issue. Now, I really worry that perhaps we have not been creating enough jobs the number of jobs are coming down. And that is what people are saying, that we don't see how this growth is happening because they don't feel that the employment numbers have improved.
Now, a second area of concern, gentlemen, is to do with a debate about next year's fiscal deficit target of 3.5%. Arvind Subramaniam, the chief economic advisor, has argued in his midterm economic review that it should be relaxed so that the government has funds to invest in infrastructure. And he, according to some interpretations, has taken a similar line in the economic policy review as well. Raghuram Rajan, Arvind Panagriya and Kaushik Basu, on the other hand, firmly believe that the government must stick to its fiscal deficit target, otherwise there would be a credibility problem. As a former chief economic advisor, Dr. Acharya, what would you advise the finance minister?
Well, there's the old adage, if you've got 4 economists, you've got 6 views. But I'll limit myself to siding with the three or four that you mentioned in the latter part of your question. Namely, I think I would err on the side of caution and stick to the earlier target of 3.5% of GDP rather than relax it. I should also note, by the way, that the economic survey by Dr. Subramaniam is, I think, more even-handed. He kind of doesn't take a final view, unlike the midterm report that you referred to. Now, my reasons for supporting some moderate fiscal consolidation are as follows. One, if you continue with pressing the pause button this year as well, you lose credibility in a significant way. We did it last year, as you recall, or Mr. Jaitley did rather, and doing it again is not a good thing. Secondly, remember that in both these years, we had terms of trade benefit because of mainly declining oil prices as well as other commodities, to the tune of about, oil alone, 2% of GDP, of which, in each year, of which the government is estimated to have gained about half, that is 1% of GDP, through increased excise taxes on oil and so forth, as well as reduced subsidies on a variety of commodities. So in a year, and this is the second year, where the government is getting this kind of windfall benefit on its accounts, it should be able to accommodate things like the pay commission and so forth, and still bring about a very modest reduction of 0.4% of GDP, in my view. Another reason, I think, is that we are living in a very fragile global economy. And I don't want to go on about that, but I think everybody knows the facts. And in that context, I think it's a good rule of thumb to maintain, if you like, somewhat tighter rein on your own fiscal house than otherwise. And thirdly, as we know that in this last year or two, nominal GDP growth has been quite low. In fact, much lower than what people had expected. By nominal, I mean without discounting for inflation. And what happens in that situation is if you run a higher deficit, then your debt ratios start climbing quite appreciably, the government debt ratio. So I think that's something it's already pretty high compared to similar placed countries. And so we don't want to, I think, go down that road.
Mr. Seshasayee,
I think these are my reasons for saying...
I take it those are 3 very good reasons, which in fact I hope the finance minister is hearing, although it may be a bit late to influence his mind. I'm sure his mind by now is made up. But Mr. Seshasayee, you heard Dr. Acharya there talk about the pressure from OROP and, more importantly, the pressure from the 7th Pay Commission recommendations. And if the government, it's believed, is going to fulfill those commitments in full, then it won't have money left to invest in infrastructure. Now, if relaxing the fiscal deficit as an option is out, do you think the government should be considering things like either postponing the fulfillment of the 7th Pay Commission, push it down a year or maybe a bit more, or should it be considering an extensive and widespread disinvestment campaign, including the strategic sale of profitable PSUs?
I think Dr. Acharya made some three very important points. So let me make three not so good points. Firstly, I think this debate is getting to be perhaps too simplistically binary, fiscal deficit versus growth. And in this context, we are talking about only the central government's fiscal deficit. And we all know that increasingly the state government deficits are getting to be larger than the central government deficit. And it's not merely the quantitative aspect of this. It's also the fact that the kind of deficit that state governments are running into are arising as a result of more profligate expenditure, freebies, particularly because of the oncoming elections in some states. So the quality of the expenditure and the quality of the deficit in the total pie, the state and the center, is something that we have to worry about. So therefore, to talk about the fiscal deficit of the center alone without the qualitative aspect of the national fiscal deficit as a whole, I think is a misleading thing. Second, to my mind, this is a seesaw situation between the fiscal deficit issue and the monetary easing issue. I think the governor has made it very clear that if fiscal deficit is not reined in, he is going to have that much less headroom for monetary relaxation, and it makes sense to do that. Therefore, are we saying that we would opt for government expenditure to spur economy rather than private investment to spur economy? Because the more government chooses to spend and therefore exaggerate the fiscal deficit, is going to mean that much more debt from government.
I take your point, Mr. Seshasayee.
Which is going to crowd out.
You're coming to the same conclusion as Dr. Acharya, which is what leads me to ask the question, is how then, if he should not be relaxing the fiscal deficit target, should the government meet things like OROP and the 7th Pay Commission? Would you advocate postponing the 7th Pay Commission? Would you advocate sweeping disinvestment, including the strategic sale of profitable PSUs?
No, I was going to come to the third point to say that I don't think there is any point in postponing this. I think there is enough headroom available now, given the very favorable tailwinds we have from the global situation on the commodities and the fairly buoyant revenue that you will have. And I have no doubt that the service tax will also see some spike. And there is enough headroom now to tackle both. I don't think that there is an issue relating to maintaining a fiscal discipline. Well, it may not be exactly 3.5, but we're talking about between 3.5 and 3.9. But the trajectory, I mean, you at least see that the glide path to coming
just a
down
moment. I'm going to go back to Dr. Acharya on that, because if he doesn't actually hit 3.5, the specific figure, Dr. Acharya, but comes in, as you heard Mr. Seshasayee say, on a trajectory that's downwards below 3.9 but above 3.5, would that satisfy you, or would that worry you and worry markets? In other words, what if he comes in at 3.7, 3.6?
It would worry me about the efficiency of the, not the efficiency, but the creativity of the finance ministry not to be able to fudge 0.2% of GDP on the fiscal deficit credibly.
Okay, that's very clear. We have a clear divergence of views between the two of you. Let's then come to the second part of this discussion. What would you, Mr. Seshasayee, as an industrialist, you're chairman of Infosys and IndusInd Bank, you're vice chairman of Ashok Leyland, what would you be hoping are the big measures Mr. Jaitley announces on Monday?
I think there must be one pivotal part, and that is to do with the rural economy, because that's the part which is in distress. We have a worry there because the real wages are declining in the rural market, and unless we therefore put more money in the pockets of the rural consumer, we're not going to see the economy ticking back again, and that can only come with rural infrastructure spending. And therefore I would imagine that there must be a sizable step up in the government, the public expenditure relating to the rural market and the rural economy. That must be the pivot. The second, of course, is to do a slew of things which will trigger private investments taking off, And that can come only on the back of leading public investment in certain areas, for example, the smart cities, the urban development, because it has been proven that you have a multiplier effect when you put money in urban development, because it then results in private investments coming off its back. And therefore, you've got to choose the kind of investment where public investments have to go, which will have a tag-along effect on private investments, and that's got to be chosen very carefully.
Let me put the very same question to you, Dr. Acharya. You're not just a former chief economic advisor, you're also chairman of Kotak Mahindra. What would you be hoping for in Monday's budget?
I'm not sure which capacity I'm answering this, but I think let me do it as just an economist. And you see, I think aside from the fiscal consolidation I mentioned already, I think it's important that this be seen as in some sense, a back to basics budget. And by that I mean that the tax proposals should be sensible ones. There should be a focus on, in a sense, following through what was promised earlier. For example, as you know, in the last budget, the finance minister had said that the corporate tax rate would be gradually brought down from 30 to 25% over 5 years. And of course, he did nothing last year. Now, I think if he doesn't do something this year, there will be a serious loss of credibility. Now, so I think he should consider very seriously reducing the corporate tax rate by 1 or 2%, but together with offsetting axing of exemptions of an equivalent amount, so it's revenue neutral. So I think that is certainly important. Now, following through, and this is not a budget matter, but what has already been put in the Parliament, the bankruptcy bill, which was announced in the last budget, I think is very important. Now, it's not a further announcement in the budget to be made. I think also that given the enormous stress on the balance sheets of particularly the public sector banks, but not only the public sector banks, as well as the corresponding leverage problem of a large number of fairly sizable corporates, some kind of further, if you like, roadmap over and above the Indradhanush program, which was announced a few months ago, and the additional capitalization that is a foregone conclusion, I think would be a very
Are you talking about the announcement of an asset reconstruction company that Nirmala Sitharaman in an interview to me earlier this month suggested could be on the anvil?
It could be. I mean, I'm not trying to be saying that this is one or the other. It could, you know, I mean, if one was really hopeful, which perhaps it's too late to be, but maybe why not on your program, Karan? You know, really one should consider doing something to implement the PJ Nayak committee report, which essentially saw a way forward of reducing the public sector's control of these banks. Through a sort of holding company and etc. and that sort of thing.
Let's say there's a slew of options for the finance minister. There's a slew of options for him, and you're hoping that he'll pick the most ambitious of them, but at the bottom you're hoping that he'll pick at least one of them, even if it's not the most ambitious. And the tension lies in the fact we don't know what he's going to do till he does it. But you heard Mr. Seshasayee, Dr. Acharya talk about the bankruptcy bill. Many people say even more important is GST, and then there's the real estate bill.
Karan, can I say?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, can I make just one other point, which is, and it's taking off from what Mr. Seshasayee said earlier, which is, I think it's important we use this budget as an opportunity to show that government and RBI, the Reserve Bank, are on the same page. And so if the fiscal deficit can be reduced by the 0.4% of GDP, it would be good if the finance minister announced that at the same time the central bank is going to reduce the repo rate by 0.25%, because this would kind of give a sense of fiscal monetary policy coordination, as well as you know, remove all the usual kind of pink paper chat about
I'm rushing you on because I'm running out of time. Do you agree with that suggestion, Mr. Seshasayee, that a 0.4% reduction in the fiscal deficit target accompanied by a 0.25 reduction in the repo rate?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this has happened in the past, and I think it's a good thing to do. It will send a signal not merely that the two are in coordination, but it will also give the signal that there is going to be money available to support the economic growth.
Can I put something else to you very quickly, Mr. Seshasayee? You heard Dr. Acharya talk about the importance of the bankruptcy bill. There's also the GST, which some think is an even bigger priority, and then there's real estate. But at the moment, because of the confusion, if not impasse in our politics, many people fear these bills will be stalled once again. Now, if that turns out to be the case, will it send out a very adverse message? Or in a sense, is that fear already factored in both by markets and investors, and therefore will it leave sentiment largely unaffected? Which of the two?
My sense is, if I have to be absolutely candid, GST has become a bit of an excuse now for not investing or not looking at India seriously. You know, let's face the fact that in the bubble years, in the 2000 to 2006, we had a number of companies coming and investing in India, foreign companies, local companies investing in India, when there was no GST. This is not to mean that GST should not happen. In fact, I've been a very strong advocate that it should happen. It should happen fast enough. And this is a major game-changing thing, although I believe that the manner in which it is currently done is just the beginning of the journey. But at least we had to begin the journey.
You're saying its delay is not a disincentive. Its delay doesn't send out the adverse message that the pink papers and commentators sometimes suggest it does. That's what you're saying, aren't you?
I think on the other way of putting it is that if the GST gets passed, then I think it will be seen to be a very, very pleasant surprise. And the market will react very positively to it.
Gentlemen, we're running critically short of time, so I'll ask you for short answers. In your opinion, Dr. Acharya, is this a make or break budget as people as well as the pink papers are suggesting, or is that journalistic hype and nothing more than exaggerated popular expectation?
I think it's to some extent a journalistic hype. Because I think we should not forget that economic policy, particularly fiscal and monetary policy, is made throughout the year, and that's the way it's always been. And as in fact our discussion already points out, items like very important items like the GST bill, like the bankruptcy bill, you know, piloting those through Parliament against the odds sometimes. Would actually be perhaps much more important than the budget in this budget.
In other words,
those are, I think, really forward-looking.
In other words,
policies.
the success of the government's legislative agenda could be more important than the actual contents of the budget. Is that right? In a nutshell?
Exactly.
What about your opinion, Mr.
Provided. One big proviso. One big proviso that the budget does not do serious harm through any measures like surprise taxes of a nature which don't make sense, like which you've had before, like further retrospective taxation or taxes on financial transactions and so forth.
That's a very fair point. Mr. Seshasayee, this may well have to be the last question on this show. What is your assessment of the way the Modi government has handled the economy so far? And I suppose what I'm asking, in effect, is what is your assessment of Arun Jaitley as finance minister?
No, I think, I've said this earlier in your show, Karan, I think a lot of very good steps have been taken, a lot of good policy initiatives have been taken, but let's accept that there are lots of headwinds, and also some of these have not actually landed on the ground, and we have to give enough time for these policies to translate to physical action on the ground. So it's still a journey. The journey has still been begun, but the truth of the matter is that yes, we haven't seen enough results yet on the ground, and that's a big dampener on the sentiment part.
That reminds me of Robert Frost. The woods are silent, dark and deep, and I have miles to go before I sleep. The problem is, the country is getting tired of walking. It wants to get to the destination and it can't see, if I can mix my metaphors, the light at the end of the tunnel. My thanks to both of you for a very eye-opening and enlightening discussion on the budget, on the challenges the country faces, and more importantly, on the steps the finance minister should take. Now we have to wait till Monday to see whether Mr. Jaitley is listening to Mr. Seshasayee and Dr. Acharya. If you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.